I'm getting a bunch of text messages. I got to go. Let me turn off my phone and come jump back. He's trying to find this odor in the car. So I'm getting messages of like an emoji. And then the last emoji said, I'm just going to burn the car. And I'm like, I can't think and like keep doing this. Greg Fung.
Hey, Scott Rice.
All right, we are in episode 1 of our unimaginatively named podcast, Conversations. Greg, what do you think about this? Are you still comfortable with the name of this podcast?
You know, it's great. I mean, it's straightforward. It tells you what to expect. So here we are.
Good. It doesn't. Every podcast is a conversation. So here we are. But it's under Theology Lab. So our goal is to help name a little bit about what we're actually getting into. Here's the question I'm hoping we can explore, Greg. It's actually a couple of questions. Let me run them by you here. Is theology for experts only?
Yeah.
And can theology, in fact, be exciting? The question I really want to get at is, can theology be part of what it means for some people, not all, of being Christian? So, but we can. I hope we can get to that.
Yeah.
Okay, Greg, you are, I think, one of the most interesting theological conversation partners that I know of, and so tell me really quick. Tell me. Why do you care about theology? Why do you get into theological conversations, or even just like what are we talking about when we say theology?
Yeah. Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. You know, it's funny. One of your questions was, does theology have to be boring? And I say there are members of my close family who would say yes, it is boring.
Yeah, it is. It's just we leave it right there, and that's it.
This will be a short episode. But why is it interesting? You know, I've been thinking about this question because it's a funny thing. It's this thing that I don't have to talk about, but I feel compelled to talk about when I have the opportunity. And, you know, I feel like there aren't a ton of people who I get to talk about theology with. And the closest thing I can think of is I've also been obsessed with, this will seem very narrow, but I've been obsessed with early 20th century Chinese history.
Yeah.
And I think it's for the same reason, which is, so a lot happened to my family in the early 20th century in China, different parts of China. And I've been obsessed with it because a lot of it just explains so much of who I am and how my family was formed and how we ended up where we are and kind of the ways we interact, or also like personality tests, the Myers-Briggs, the Enneagram. It's the same sort of thing where I can get really obsessed about these things because it just gives me some handles to understand, like, who are we? And why do we interact with the world the way I do? I think theology feels very similar to me, where we're swimming in this, say, Christian world for those who come from that world, as I do. I don't always understand it, and theology gives me some similar handles, some similar understanding of, like, what is this and why and where does this come from, and maybe where does this help me understand where we might go?
All right, so you've said that there's times where you feel compelled to talk about theology that helps you understand yourself, navigating the world. Can you give an example of how theology has been that practical for you?
Yes. Yeah. One would simply be in contemporary, like our contemporary culture right now in November of 2025 in the United States. Christian nationalism is on the rise, and it is tied to my own faith tradition. And that's confusing for me. And so I think unpacking that without really understanding deeply these theological roots is probably like trying to fight with one arm behind your back. You really need to get down to the theology to understand, like, where did this come from? How do we end up here? And why is this happening? And then where do we go from here? So theology, I think, is a deep piece to beginning to pull apart some of those pieces. Another example would be my kids, who are now teenagers. They've got some good questions. I don't have a lot of answers. And I find that a lot of the apologetics material that I grew up with doesn't land very well with them or with me. And in fact, there's a way in which maybe these are actually theological questions, not apologetics questions. And so it's compelling me to kind of go and have these theological conversations.
Yeah. Okay. So it's interesting to me that you say it becomes, you wanted whatever theology is, and I don't know if we'll have to kind of maybe unpack what we mean when we even think the word theology, but that it becomes something you're driven to when it becomes personal. Like when you realize something that is part of you and your tradition comes together with something that you're feeling really uneasy about. You mentioned the example of
Mm.
Christian nationalism, or even the questions that you and your kids are navigating, and just like there's no way around it, right? Like this is like I have to explore this in a way that what I'm doing I'm calling theology. Thanks for watching this Theology Lab video. If you're enjoying it, you can subscribe to the channel below and you'll get more Theology Lab videos as soon as they're released.
Yes. And there's a way in which if I don't, then I'm either wholesale rejecting it, running away from it,
Yeah.
or ignoring it, putting my head in the sand, neither of which feel like great options.
Yeah.
There needs to be some way to engage with it in order to move forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So how about you, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good way for me to try to answer this is actually like so right now, like I guess I'm a professional theologian, right? I get paid to
Mm,
do the work I do around Theology Lab. So let me even go to a time before I ever imagined becoming a theologian. And I think about a moment where like I had an understanding of what the Bible was, a certain concept of what it meant, how it all fit together as history, as morality, as a guide for my life. And I took a class that just really challenged a lot of the basic presuppositions of what the Bible meant to me. And I felt in some ways just totally uncertain. Like I was just kind of like thrown out there helpless. I still believed I and now I had these new questions that I had to consider, right? It was the fact that like I had
mm,
experienced the reality of God. I still believed, but this foundational thing for my faith had kind of come undone. And I wasn't I just like I felt like I'm gonna use your language here. I felt compelled to continue to address that. And whatever happened in continuing to address that, I now
mm.
think of as like, oh, that was theological. With I
Yeah,
mean, the explorations, the questions, the ways things came back together in a
yeah.
in a much different way. If nothing else, maybe we can bring out that like theology and our personal lives and our biographies, they go hand in hand.
Yeah.
All right, so that's why I think we've addressed like this is why it personally matters, and I think can be relevant for right, an ordinary Christian. It's just it's looking at the things that matter deeply to you that you feel like you need to continue to address as a person of faith, as a Christian. Um, but before we close up here, can we give a go at how we would define theology? I'm just going to name up front, probably dealing with multiple definitions, and that's okay. But how would you spin theology?
You wanna go first? I gotta think about this.
Yeah, so I've got one, and admittedly, this one's kind of in my pockets, but unpacking it's not. So it's one of my favorite definitions of what theology is. It comes from theologian Robert Jensen, and he said, theology is that yesterday we heard the gospel, we heard something of good news, and we believed it. Right, we became Christians, and then tomorrow we know we need to say it again tomorrow. Theology is what happens in between. And okay, so let me just unpack that just a little bit, right? What I think Jensen is trying to say in this kind of like nifty short little expression is that theology is the fact that we believe, but we exist in this world where all these new things come at us, new questions come at us. We want to explore. We have different experiences. We somehow believe that like the message we've heard is a message to share again, and we've got to think about how to say that in a
Mm,
responsible, faithful way. So there's something inherent just about believing the Christian message that requires us to do theology. And one of the most evident, obvious places you can experience this is you just sit down with people who are working with youth, who are working in the church with younger
mm,
populations. And my goodness, like they have to think like so hard and intensive. Like what does it mean to take the thing that we've received that we believe is good news and communicate it with populations speaking very different languages and dealing with different concepts. Let me pause there, Greg, and think like, all right, that's one take on what theology is and looks like. I wonder if you have what about you?
for me, it's for me, it's more like, that Anselm quote, "Faith-seeking understanding." It's just like,
Mm,
what do we actually believe and why, and how does it fit together? Or does it fit together? Um, or maybe what should we believe and why? I think this is, and in at least for me, in a kind of a systematic, logical framework. versus individual belief statements. How did all these pieces fit together? So that to me, as I'm kind of a tidy person, I like to have things in buckets, and so
Mm.
it helps me to have it all systematized to some degree.
We should have started with your definition before mine because that is your definition is the classical one, and it's so good, right? There's a reason I feel like this idea, right, of faith seeking understanding. The order, like, tell me what you think about this, right? The order of that is faith first and then understanding second. That seems significant to me because it is not like i- it's not saying, hey, you first like have this concrete, absolute reason to believe, and then you're figuring things out that just fit into that already set mold. It's like, no, you meet God, there's this somehow experience of faith, um, and out of that is a life of understanding. It's this I guess I'm trying to draw out
Mm,
the significance of that word seeking. Are you drawn to that definition at all because of that word seeking? Or
yeah,
is that just, something I like?
yeah, yeah. I think um, I don't think it was always true. I think there was a way in which, as a youth, theology was um, more about who is it? Uh, Descartes, who kind of builds a purely logical framework for faith. That's what it was more for me. It was a set of proofs to bolster my worldview, as it were. But over time, that's been hard to sort of rely on, and it does
Mm.
feel more like I have this level of faith, but I don't really understand it, and so I'm trying to figure it out, and theology is the helpful means with which I can do that. So, hence the seeking becomes much more important versus the knowing or the proving.
All right. If I hear this conversation as trying to make a case that theology is not just for experts, I would look back on what we've talked about so far and I would say, all right, we both said how theology comes out of like real felt needs in our lives. But what I don't think we've really answered, Greg, or spoken to is what is theology? What does it look like doing theology? Uh, if you're not an expert, what does it look like to do theology
Mm,
if you consider yourself an ordinary Christian and you're thinking, "Okay,
yeah.
that's intriguing how they're talking about that, but, like, does this mean I need to go to seminary or divinity school? Does this mean I need to, like, study up to join the conversation?"
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to me, this is similar to go back to this idea of history or psychology. I'm not a historian, but history is important. Understanding history to some degree is really important, I think, for everyone. Or understanding yourself. I'm not a psychologist, but having some self-awareness is, I think, important for everyone. And
Hmm,
likewise, understanding theology, you don't have to be an expert. I mean, you could be, and there are experts. We're grateful for them, for people like you who've, really committed your life to studying it. That's fantastic. But everyone needs to grapple with it to some degree, or suffer the consequences of being unaware, and of being somewhat blind to where we're going and where we've come from. So yeah, I think it's important that we all do it to differing degrees, and grateful to interact with those who've studied more.
okay, an interesting word that you use to me is self-understanding, a greater self-awareness. If you're looking for just one thing to like start to one thing to explore that may bring you into kind of theological conversations is what is it that I'm learning that is intriguing? What am I learning about myself? What am I learning about God that I just feel drawn into more? There's like ways where I'm like, hey, we should be able to talk about doing theology. Let's not use the word theology. Let's
Huh.
say like what are the questions and issues that we are trying to grapple with in order to be faithful? And
Yeah.
then, 30 minutes later, let's look back and say, actually, guess what? That was it. Like we're all doing this. Like a thinking Christian is doing that word that I'm not using right now. One other thing I'll bring into this conversation, years ago when we were thinking about the name of what this group would be called, this learning community, and we landed on Theology Lab. I was
Mm,
like, I knew I want it to be theology. I want theology to be in the name of it because there's something that this name's like, all right, this is a group that's going to be about these kind of intentional conversations. But I know that there's a barrier to using that word theology. So when we put lab in there, which needs explanation as well, it was about like combining the word theology, this kind of like big word that can be a barrier with a notion of a lab as a place of exploration, a place
Mm,
of conversation. And maybe this is even our next conversation is that like I want to look at why is conversation and discussion not just an interesting thing, but actually something that's essential to
mm,
what theology has to be, and maybe even more importantly, what it means to be Christian. Like the
right.
conversation and discussion are essential to believing. So we're out of time to get into that now, but maybe we go there next. All right, Greg, good to be with you.
Till then.